First story, by Emily Johnson. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a leisurely walk through the old graveyard on the outskirts of town. The fading sunlight cast eerie shadows on the crumbling headstones, and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze filled the air with a soft, unsettling symphony. I had always found cemeteries to be peaceful places, a perfect spot for quiet contemplation, but that evening, something felt different. As I strolled among the rows of weathered tombstones, a sense of unease washed over me. The atmosphere was heavy, and the air had a peculiar chill, even though the day had been warm. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around and scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. Shrugging it off as my overactive imagination, I continued my walk. As I ventured deeper into the graveyard, the light grew dimmer, and a sense of isolation intensified. It was then that I noticed a small group of people huddled together near one of the older mausoleums. They seemed to be engaged in some sort of ceremony, though I couldn't make out the details from where I stood. Curiosity piqued. I approached them cautiously. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods. The air grew colder as I got closer, and the hair on my arms stood on end. I strained my ears to listen, and what I heard sent a shiver down my spine. The group was chanting in a language I couldn't understand, and their voices were low and mournful. The words seemed to carry a weight, as if they held some dark, ancient power. I was too far away to make out their faces or their intentions, but it was clear that something bizarre and unsettling was unfolding before me. As I debated whether to approach further or retreat, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the lantern they had been using to light their ceremony. In the ensuing darkness, I stumbled backward, falling over a low gravestone and making a noise that surely gave me away. The hooded figures turned in my direction, and for a moment we all froze. Then, in a synchronized motion, they began to approach me. Panic gripped my chest as I scrambled to my feet and fled from the graveyard. I didn't look back until I was safely outside the cemetery gates, my heart racing. The hooded figures had stopped at the threshold, their eyes, which gleamed with an unnatural light, fixed on me. They had not pursued me beyond the graveyard's boundaries, but the feeling of being watched persisted until I was safely back in my own home. To this day, I can't explain the strange, otherworldly encounter in that haunted graveyard. I've never returned to that place, and the sense of unease I felt has stayed with me, a constant reminder of the bizarre events of that autumn evening. Second story, by David Mitchell. It was a clear summer night when I found myself alone in the abandoned graveyard on the outskirts of Cedarville, a small town in upstate New York. I had always been fascinated by old cemeteries, and this one had piqued my interest due to its long-forgotten history. As I wandered among the dilapidated tombstones, the moon cast an eerie glow on the weathered names and dates, each telling a story of lives long past. It was a peaceful and quiet place, or so I thought. But as I roamed deeper into the graveyard, I heard faint, distant whispers. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the sound. The voices grew louder, and I soon found myself at the edge of a circular depression in the ground, a pit that appeared to have been freshly dug. In the middle of this pit, I could see a group of people gathered around a fire. As I got closer, I realized these were not just any people. They were individuals dressed in tattered clothing, their faces gaunt and eyes empty. They were conducting a strange, unsettling ceremony, their movements jerky and unnatural. I watched in both fascination and fear as they chanted in unison, their words incomprehensible but filled with an eerie, haunting quality. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the air seemed to thicken around me. My heart raced as I considered retreating, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if an invisible force held me in place, preventing me from leaving. Then, one of the participants turned toward me, locking eyes with mine. In that moment, I felt a surge of terror, as if this person could see into my very soul. His lips curled into a sinister smile, and he beckoned me to join them. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. Just as I thought I was lost, a loud, piercing shriek echoed through the graveyard. It was a sound that sent chills down my spine, and the hooded figures turned their attention to the source of the noise. I took the opportunity to break free from the invisible grip that held me and made a run for it. I didn't look back until I was safely back in my car, the engine roaring to life. The hooded figures were gone, and the depression in the ground was empty. I drove away from that cursed graveyard, my heart pounding and my mind reeling from the bizarre and terrifying encounter. To this day, I can't explain what I witnessed in that haunted graveyard, and I haven't been back to Cedarville since. The memory of those hooded figures and their chilling ceremony still haunts my dreams, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected of places. Third story, by Sarah Anderson. It was a chilly evening in the coastal town of Havenwood, Oregon, when I found myself wandering into the old, overgrown graveyard that had long been abandoned. The salty sea breeze carried with it the scent of decay and salt water, creating an eerie atmosphere that sent shivers down my spine. I had heard whispers of strange happenings in the graveyard, tales of odd occurrences and unexplained phenomena. As a skeptic, I decided to investigate the stories for myself, armed with my camera and a healthy dose of skepticism. The graveyard was a maze of crumbling tombstones and overgrown vegetation. I meandered through the uneven paths, my camera ready to capture any evidence of the supernatural. The fading light of dusk cast long shadows, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. As I continued deeper into the cemetery, I came across a weathered, ornate mausoleum that stood out among the other dilapidated graves. Its door, slightly ajar, beckoned me to explore further. My curiosity got the better of me, and I gently pushed the door open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The dim light from my flashlight illuminated the interior, and I was met with an eerie sight. Inside the mausoleum, candles flickered, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, a group of people dressed in old-fashioned attire were engaged in some kind of macabre ritual. They chanted softly in a language I couldn't comprehend, their voices echoing off the cold, stone walls. Their actions were deliberate and unsettling, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. My skepticism waned as a sense of foreboding washed over me. As I snapped pictures with my camera, I accidentally stepped on a loose floorboard, creating a loud creaking sound. The hooded figures halted their chant and turned to face me. Fear gripped me as their piercing, unseeable eyes locked onto mine. One of them stepped forward, slowly raising an ancient-looking dagger. In a voice that sent shivers down my spine, he spoke in broken English. "You've seen too much. You must join us or share the same fate as those who came before." Panic surged through my veins as I stumbled backward and out of the mausoleum, the door slamming shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car, parked at the cemetery's entrance. When I reviewed the photos I had taken, I was shocked to find that they had all turned out blurry and distorted, as if the camera had captured something beyond the scope of human understanding. The images were a chilling reminder of the terror I had encountered in that haunted graveyard, and I knew I had narrowly escaped a fate that I couldn't comprehend. To this day, I can't explain what I witnessed, and I haven't returned to that graveyard in Havenwood. The supernatural is real, and it lurks in the most unexpected places, waiting to ensnare those who dare to venture too close. Fourth story, by Mark Reynolds. The sun was setting over the town of Blackwood, a remote village nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. I had heard stories about the local cemetery that sent chills down my spine, and my curiosity finally got the better of me one gloomy evening. The graveyard was isolated and surrounded by dense forest, making it feel like a place forgotten by time. As I entered through the rusted iron gates, I couldn't help but notice the oppressive silence that enveloped the area. The overcast sky added to the ominous ambience, creating an atmosphere of unease. I began to walk amongst the ancient tombstones, some so weathered that the inscriptions had become illegible. The gnarled trees cast long, distorted shadows, and the air grew colder with every step I took. I knew I was trespassing on hallowed ground, but something urged me to continue. As I ventured further into the graveyard, I noticed a group of people gathered near the oldest mausoleum in the cemetery. They were dressed in tattered clothing and appeared to be engaged in a strange, frenzied dance. Their movements were erratic and unsettling, and their faces contorted with an unnatural intensity. The sound of their chanting reached my ears, and it was unlike anything I had ever heard. The words were twisted and incomprehensible, filled with an air of malevolence. I kept my distance, hidden behind a tombstone, watching their bizarre performance in horrified fascination. The atmosphere grew thick with tension, and the air seemed to crackle with an energy that was both electrifying and terrifying. It was then that I noticed the ground beneath them begin to shake, sending tremors through the cemetery. The hooded figures continued their strange dance, seemingly unaffected by the seismic activity. The tremors intensified, causing tombstones to topple and the earth to crack open. It was as though some ancient force had been awakened, and the very ground itself rebelled against their ritual. Fear clutched at my heart as I realized the danger of the situation. With a sudden and violent eruption, a plume of thick, black smoke billowed from the open grave. The hooded figures were consumed by the darkness, and their frantic chanting turned to panic screams. I watched in shock as they were pulled beneath the earth, disappearing without a trace. I fled the cemetery as the ground continued to shake, and the wails of the hooded figures echoed in the distance. The feeling of dread followed me, and I knew I had witnessed something far beyond the realm of the living. To this day, I can't explain the strange and otherworldly events that occurred in that haunted graveyard in Blackwood. I never returned to that place, haunted by the memory of the hooded figures and the unnatural forces they had invoked. Fifth story, by Edward Harrison. The small town of Eastwood, nestled in the hills of northern Vermont, was known for its picturesque landscapes and quaint charm. But it also harbored a dark secret, a desolate, long-forgotten graveyard that had been a source of dread for generations. One summer evening, my curiosity led me to explore this forsaken place. The graveyard was a labyrinth of crumbling headstones and gnarled trees, casting long, twisted shadows. As I ventured deeper into the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The night was exceptionally still, and the silence was suffocating. It was as if the world held its breath, waiting for something to happen. My unease grew as I came across a group of people huddled around an old, decaying tree. They were engaged in a strange and unsettling activity, their faces obscured by tattered cloaks. I crouched behind a large headstone and watched in trepidation as they chanted in a language I couldn't understand. Their voices were low and filled with a mournful, haunting quality. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the night. The hooded figures were so absorbed in their ritual that they didn't notice my presence. I considered making a hasty exit, but my curiosity kept me rooted in place. I needed to know what they were doing and why they had chosen this forsaken graveyard for their ceremony. As they continued their chant, the ground beneath the tree began to tremble. It was as though the very earth was responding to their dark incantations. I watched in shock as the tree's branches shivered and twisted, producing an eerie, guttural groan. With a deafening crack, the tree splintered and fell to the ground, revealing a yawning pit beneath it. The hooded figures did not seem surprised by this development. Instead, they descended into the hole, disappearing one by one. The pit closed behind them, leaving no trace of their presence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, hoping to see if they would reemerge. But the cemetery remained eerily silent. With a sense of unease gnawing at me, I made my escape from that cursed graveyard. To this day, I can't explain the bizarre and unsettling events that unfolded in that haunted graveyard in Eastwood, Vermont. The memory of the hooded figures and the unearthly tree still haunts me, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are best left undisturbed. Sixth Story, by Laura Mitchell. A cold, misty night descended upon the town of Ravenwood, a remote village hidden deep within the Bavarian forest of Germany. The village's cemetery was old, and its eerie reputation drew many curious visitors, myself included. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of trepidation, I ventured into the dark graveyard. The cemetery was a tangled labyrinth of crooked tombstones and overgrown graves, their shapes distorted by the eerie glow of the moon. The mist hung low to the ground, creating a spectral atmosphere that sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the weight of centuries of history pressing upon me. As I ventured further into the graveyard, the hushed whispers of leaves and the distant cry of an owl were the only sounds I could hear. It was then that I noticed a group of people near the old mausoleum, bathed in the pale light of a flickering lantern. They were dressed in tattered clothing, and their faces were hidden beneath hooded cloaks. Their voices were hushed as they chanted in a language I couldn't understand, their words echoing through the mist. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and an unsettling heaviness lingered in the air. I watched from a distance, my heart pounding, as they continued their eerie ceremony. The hooded figures moved in slow, synchronized patterns, and the darkness seemed to respond to their presence. The mist thickened, and strange, ethereal shapes danced around them. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as a creeping sense of dread enveloped me. As the ceremony continued, the ground beneath the group began to shift and tremble. I watched in horror as the earth opened up, revealing a vast, dark pit beneath them. They continued to chant, seemingly unperturbed by the earth's violent reaction. With a sudden and chilling certainty, I realized that I had to get away. I turned to leave, but my flashlight went out, plunging me into total darkness. The mist closed in around me, and the sounds of the hooded figures became distant and distorted. Frantic and disoriented, I stumbled blindly through the graveyard, unable to find my way back to the entrance. It felt like an eternity, but I eventually emerged from the mist, standing just outside the cemetery gates. The hooded figures and their eerie ceremony were nowhere to be seen. I left the graveyard, shaken to my core, and made my way back to the village. I couldn't explain the strange, unsettling events I had witnessed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something far beyond the realm of the living. To this day, I have never returned to that haunted graveyard in Ravenwood, haunted by the memory of the hooded figures and the unearthly phenomena that defied all explanation. It was a night I will never forget, a reminder that there are mysteries in this world that should remain shrouded in darkness. Seventh Story, by Daniel Richardson. A brisk autumn evening found me in the small town of Silverton, nestled in the heart of the Colorado Rockies. The town's graveyard was famous for its historical significance, but it was also infamous for strange occurrences. With the chill in the air and the vibrant colors of fall surrounding me, I decided to explore this eerie place. The graveyard was a mix of weathered tombstones, aging trees, and the smell of decaying leaves that blanketed the ground. The fading light painted long shadows, casting an unsettling pall over the quiet resting place of the departed. The whispers of the wind through the trees added to the eerie ambience. As I walked deeper into the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and a sense of unease settled over me. It was then that I came across a group of people gathered around a grave, their clothing tattered and disheveled. They were engaged in a peculiar ceremony, their voices low and mournful as they chanted in unison. The words were foreign and carried an eerie weight, sending shivers down my spine. I watched from behind a nearby tombstone, the sense of dread growing with each passing moment. The air grew colder as I observed the hooded figures. The flickering lantern they had placed by the grave cast an eerie light on their faces, revealing their gaunt features. They continued to chant, their movements jerky and unsettling. As I watched, I noticed that the grave they had chosen was surrounded by odd symbols and markings carved into the earth. The symbols seemed to pulsate with an otherworldly energy, and I had a creeping feeling that this was no ordinary ceremony. Just when I was considering making a hasty retreat, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, and the earth trembled beneath me. The hooded figures stopped their chanting, their heads turning in my direction. Fear surged through me as their unearthly, luminescent eyes locked onto mine. I froze for a moment, my heart racing, before turning and running as fast as I could. The ground beneath me quaked, and I stumbled over tombstones in my haste to escape. I didn't look back until I was out of the cemetery and safely back in town. The hooded figures did not pursue me beyond the graveyard's gates, but the feeling of being watched lingered until I was safe in my own home. To this day, I can't explain the strange and unsettling events I witnessed in that haunted graveyard in Silverton, Colorado. The memory of the hooded figures and the bizarre ceremony still haunts me, a chilling reminder that there are places where the boundary between the living and the dead is blurred. Eighth Story, by Sarah Thompson. A foggy, moonless night settled over the coastal town of Willow's End, located in the north of California. The town's old cemetery had always been a source of local legends and chilling tales, and on that eerie night, I found myself drawn to explore its haunted grounds. The graveyard was a tangled web of crumbling tombstones and gnarled trees, their branches shrouded in mist. The air was thick with an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle every sound. As I wandered through the labyrinth of graves, the sense of isolation deepened, and I couldn't help but feel as if the shadows themselves were closing in on me. As I ventured deeper into the cemetery, I spotted a small gathering of people near an ancient mausoleum. They were dressed in ragged clothing, their faces hidden beneath hooded cloaks. It was clear they were engaged in some kind of eerie ritual, their voices murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I watched from a distance, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and fascination. The air grew colder, and the hair on my arms stood on end as I continued to observe the unsettling ceremony. The participants moved in strange, jerky motions, and the very earth beneath them seemed to shiver in response to their actions. The hooded figures continued their chant, and the atmosphere grew thick with an otherworldly energy. It was as if the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurring, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something unnatural and sinister. As I considered slipping away, the ground beneath the participants began to tremble and convulse. It was as if the earth itself was rebelling against the ritual. I watched in horror as a chasm opened beneath the hooded figures, swallowing them whole. With a deafening roar, the ground sealed shut, leaving no trace of the bizarre ceremony that had unfolded. The cemetery was once again cloaked in an eerie silence, as if nothing had ever happened. I fled the graveyard, my heart racing, and didn't stop until I was safely back in my own home. The memories of the hooded figures and their unholy ceremony continued to haunt my thoughts. To this day, I can't explain the strange and unearthly events I witnessed in that haunted graveyard in Willow's End. The experience left me with a lingering sense of dread, a constant reminder that there are places where the line between the living and the dead is thin, and where ancient, malevolent forces may still linger. Ninth Story, by Robert Smith. On a cool, misty evening in the picturesque town of Willowbrook, Massachusetts, I found myself drawn to the town's historic cemetery. The graveyard was known for its rich history, but it was also infamous for strange occurrences that sent shivers down the spines of the townsfolk. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of curiosity, I embarked on my eerie journey. The cemetery was a sprawling expanse of aging tombstones and gnarled trees, their twisted branches casting eerie silhouettes in the moonlight. The mist clung to the ground, and a dense, haunting silence hung in the air. As I meandered through the labyrinth of graves, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Deeper into the graveyard, I stumbled upon a group of people gathered around an ancient oak tree, their attire disheveled and ragged. They were engaged in a disturbing ceremony, their voices murmuring in a language I couldn't comprehend. The chilling chants echoed through the mist as I observed from a distance. The atmosphere was heavy with an unnameable dread, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. The hooded figures moved in a slow, deliberate dance, their movements unnatural and unsettling. I was simultaneously captivated and terrified by the macabre scene. I had a growing sense that this was no ordinary ritual. It was as if the very essence of the cemetery was responding to their incantations. The ground beneath them began to shift and shake, and I watched in disbelief as a portal to another realm seemed to open beneath the ancient oak. A gasp of horror escaped my lips, and the hooded figures stopped their chanting, their piercing eyes turning toward me. The dread I felt intensified as I locked eyes with one of them, and a sinister smile curled upon their lips. With fear gnawing at my heart, I turned and fled from the cemetery, my footsteps echoing through the night. The ground beneath me quaked as I made my escape, and I didn't look back until I was safely outside the cemetery gates. The memory of those hooded figures and their disturbing rituals still haunts my thoughts to this day. I can't explain the supernatural events that unfolded in that haunted graveyard in Willowbrook, Massachusetts. It was a chilling reminder that there are places where the boundary between the living and the dead is thin, and where ancient, malevolent forces may still linger. 10th Story, by Rachel Turner. One crisp, moonlit night, I ventured into the town of Harrowdale, located in the rolling hills of the English countryside. The town's ancient cemetery had always intrigued me with its history and enigmatic atmosphere, and that night, I was determined to explore its eerie depths. The cemetery was a maze of dilapidated tombstones, overgrown ivy, and ancient yew trees that cast long, skeletal shadows in the silvery moonlight. The air was still, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. As I wandered further into the graveyard, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Deeper into the cemetery, I stumbled upon a group of people gathered around an ancient, gnarled tree, their clothing tattered and faces obscured by hooded cloaks. They were engaged in a peculiar ceremony, their voices low and filled with a mournful, haunting quality. I watched from behind a crumbling tombstone, my heart pounding. The atmosphere grew heavy, and the air seemed to thicken with an otherworldly energy. The participants moved in a synchronized, eerie dance, and the ground beneath them trembled. It was as if the very earth responded to their dark incantations. As I observed in horrified fascination, the earth beneath the group of hooded figures began to crack open, revealing a deep, dark chasm beneath. The figures continued their chilling chant, seemingly unfazed by the seismic activity. My fear intensified as I realized that this was no ordinary ceremony. Just when I considered making a hasty exit, one of the hooded figures turned to face me, and their piercing, otherworldly gaze locked onto mine. A wave of terror coursed through me, and I felt as if my very soul was laid bare before them. I fled from the graveyard, my heart racing, and didn't stop until I was back in the heart of Harrowdale. The sense of being watched persisted until I was safe in my own home. The memory of those hooded figures and their disturbing ceremony still haunts my dreams. To this day, I can't explain the supernatural events that transpired in that haunted graveyard in Harrowdale, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are best left undisturbed, and that there are places where the line between the living and the dead is blurred. Thank you for joining us for the whole video. That video you see on screen is one of my favorite. Check it out. If you've enjoyed these horror stories, show your support by hitting the subscribe button. Did this tale send chills down your spine? Let me know in the comments.